Hello, everyone, and welcome to our combined Sunday school class from First Presbyterian Church here in Greensboro. I'm Lane Ridenhour, and I cordially welcome you and glad you're able to join us as we gather together today virtually to worship God on this Sunday, October 25th. Sandie Gravett will be along with our Sunday school program in just a few moments as she continues her ongoing series on Paul's letter to the church in Rome. We'll be having that in just a moment, but first, let's sing a hymn together. Today's hymn is Rock of Ages, Cleft for Me. August Montague Toplady was the author of this wonderful hymn. He was born in 1740 in England and only lived to a short age of 39. He died of tuberculosis, but he lived a very full life. He converted to Methodism at the age of 15, but then after continued Bible study, he elected to join the Church of England. There are many stories about Mr. Toplady who loved to take walks out in nature, and one day while on a walk, supposedly, a severe storm approached, and he had nowhere to go or nowhere to hide, but he saw a crack or a cleft in this gorge of rocks made of limestone nearby. So he sort of slithered into the cleft and hid there, protected from the wind and the rain. The story says that sort of made a point to him, and he jotted it down on a piece of paper and later went back and wrote a hymn about it. The idea of feeling protected from the storm. Well, regardless of whether the story is true or not, the text of the hymn, Rock of Ages is a term that he uses to refer to God. It describes the safety and the security we feel when we're surrounded and protected by the love of God. Many people can identify with that feeling, that when we're alone and afraid, we can remember that God is always on our side and will never abandon us. And that may account for the hymn's popularity. He wrote a good number of other hymns, but certainly Rock of Ages was his most famous, and it's considered by many to be probably the greatest Anglican hymn of the 19th century. I'll put the words up on the screen for you, and I invite you to sing along with me. Rock of Ages, Cleft for Me.
Rock of ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. Let the water and the blood from thy wounded side which flowed be of sin the double cure, save from wrath and make me pure. Could my tears forever flow, could my zeal no longer know, these for sin could not atone. Thou must save, and thou alone. In my hand no price I bring, simply to thy cross I cling. While I draw this fleeting breath, when my eyes shall close in death, when I rise to worlds unknown, and behold thee on thy throne, Rock of ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee.
We're continuing this week in the book of Romans, and we want to talk about what a fan the Apostle Paul is of Abraham. In the book of Romans, not to mention in texts like Galatians, Paul uses Abraham's story to talk about the idea of faith and its centrality to our relationship with God. The choice of Abraham is a logical one. Abraham is, of course, the great father, and he takes us back to a mythical era when Israel did not yet exist. But the idea of this people, apparently, was already in the mind of God. because Abraham's narrative is what we like to call an origin story. In this case, it is a story about the origin of a people. Such tales relate how things came to be as they are, but they also tell us something about who we are, what is of value to us, and what we are supposed to be doing. Let me give you a couple of examples from some different points of reference. I want to start with pop culture. Superhero stories are all the rage in the movies these days. And those stories are not just about individuals. They are also about things that are happening in the cultural setting when those superheroes emerge. We know, for instance, that Batman became who he was, a mysterious figure seeking to cleanse Gotham City from its criminal element after a young Bruce Wayne witnesses the murder of his parents. But we also know that his premiere in 1939 was at a time when urban crime was a significant problem and could easily overwhelm law enforcement. Thus, the idea of Batman was current in the culture. We understand that Superman is from another planet, but the parents who found him and raised him here taught him to use his extraordinary gifts in the service of others to make this world a better place. In a time of increasingly tall buildings and faster trains, a human who could outpace a world that suddenly made you feel small and inadequate was a comforting thought. And the creator of Wonder Woman saw her, already a powerful warrior in her own culture, as a way to combat the idea that women were inferior to men and to give young women a role model of what a powerful woman could look like in our time and in our setting. As women were starting to take on new roles, she was an imagination of all that women could be. And just in case you did not know, these stories get updated as times change and what we need from these characters also changes. And these stories don't have to be 100% fictional either. An example here would be the Broadway smash Hamilton. It was such a success in large part because it was a fresh look at historical figures, the founders of our country. It celebrated them, but it also told their story in a way that reflected 21st century sensibilities. But origin stories are not always pop culture. I know many of you are keepers of your family's origin story, how your ancestors came to these shores, who they were, and I'm going to guess how their lives and their choices shaped generations to come. We like these stories, and the ancient Jews adored these stories about Father Abraham. They told a ton of them because when they told stories about Abraham, they were also telling stories about who they were and what was important to them. Paul is no exception here. Abraham, for these people, is a reminder about the importance of listening to the promptings of the divine. He is a reminder about how one lives in relationship to God. But we don't want to forget, he is also a character who knows significant displacement and heartache and struggle. His journeys, after all, take him far from home to a strange land. He has to learn to live amongst his new neighbors who are not always friendly, and to negotiate with local leaders who are always looking to take advantage. His family situation had its ups and downs, most especially around the attempts of he and his wife Sarah to start a family of their own. His nephew Lot was an interesting character as well, and we see things happening with him both with Abraham and apart from him. I could go on, but the long and the short of it is this. Abraham's life is like the life of many people in the nation of Israel, and like the life of the nation of Israel itself, it has its highs and it has its lows. But Abraham persists no matter what. And for our purposes here today, that persistence with God is what Paul calls our attention to. Let's begin by looking at Romans chapter 4, verse 3. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God. Now, I am pointing out to you that even though the translators typically use the word believe, the verb is one we ran into last week. It's the verb from which the noun faith derives, and it means Abraham had faith. And that faith was reckoned or counted up toward his righteousness. Much to your relief, I'm going to have a little faith of my own that you remember what we've been talking about for the past couple of weeks in terms of righteousness, and I'm not going to go through that again. What I want to focus on is this idea of faith. Paul sets it up nicely. He thinks back to a text in Genesis chapter 17 where God is once again promising Abraham that he is going to be the father of many nations. Yet at this point in the story, Abraham is not a young man anymore. And we see what Paul draws from that. Abraham did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was already as good as dead, for he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. How does one, Paul is asking us to ponder, get to the point where you can keep the faith in the face of all of this contrary evidence? Well, let's go back to Genesis 17 and take a look at what Abraham does there. It's really rather remarkable. God says to Abraham, you're going to have this child, a child in your old age. Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said, in his heart, can a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Can Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? He has of human reaction. Now, we need to take this sentence apart for it to make perfect sense. Abraham does show respect for God. He falls on his face. It is still God talking. But that falling on the face is paired with an internal scoffing, an incredulousness that tells us Abraham's not swallowing the idea. Indeed, what Abraham says back to God is not this. It's not about, really, this is going to happen? I got an old wife? No way. What he says to God is simply, oh, I wish Ishmael would live before your face. In short, I already have a kid. Let's just go with that and move past all of this promise of Sarah having a baby. I want to remind you that Abraham's reaction is not inappropriate. Sarah, in the next chapter, laughs too when she first catches wind of this idea. And it's not altogether out of the ordinary for Abraham to push back a little at God. We are going to see him go toe-to-toe with God in more than one circumstance, notably in the next chapter in negotiating the fate of the city of Sodom with the righteous who might still be living there. But to get back to this story, let's look at how God handles it. God insists to Abraham that the covenant is going to be carried through a child who is not yet born, a child who will be named Isaac, precisely because they laughed when they heard this was going to come to fruition. And God promises not to forget Ishmael either. We need to remember that in choosing to put attention on this story, Paul is not stressing the covenant. He is not emphasizing that Isaac is to be favored over Ishmael. Rather, he is emphasizing that Abraham, even though he did not fully get what God was saying and had doubts enough to make him laugh at the possibility God was raising, nonetheless organized his household and did what God asked. If you'll remember the story, he got all of the men in the household, including himself, including Ishmael, circumcised. Paul describes it this way: hoping against hope, he had faith that he would become the father of many nations. For many of us, this idea reeks of being gullible. Hoping against hope? Is it not simply the ones of us who do not know when to see the handwriting on the wall and call it a day who would act in such a manner? Why should we put trust in something we cannot imagine coming to pass? Isn't that setting ourselves up for disappointment? Well, clearly the answer is no, because here we're sitting in a community with a sacred text that is full of just such moments. Let me give you two just off the top of my head. Imagine Moses standing at the edge of the Red Sea. He's listening to scared and anxious people in a panic and really giving him grief because they can't see a way forward and the Egyptians are coming up from behind all too quickly. Moses doesn't know what to do. So Moses cries out to God, and God says, "Hey, quit crying out to me. Lift up your staff and get those people through the water." And that's exactly what Moses does. Or think about Jesus' disciples. There's a big crowd that's followed them, and they're a ways from home. The sun is beginning to move towards the end of the day, and they're worried. So they come to Jesus and tell him, these people are going to have to eat. Jesus says, "Well, let's feed them." The disciples look at him and give him a little bit of incredulity. "Well, with what? We don't have any money, and frankly, there's just a couple of fish and a little bit of bread here." Yet Jesus doesn't panic. He has them organize the people, seat them at table, and sure enough, as they begin to feed them with what little they have, they produce a feast, and that feast yields leftovers because there was so much food. It is about, in summation, what Paul says in verse 17 of chapter 4. It is about believing or having faith in the God who is the one making alive the dead and calling the not existing into existing. If that is what faith is, easier said than done, right? How do we even think about going there? I actually like what Albert Einstein once said. He said, "If at first the idea is not absurd, then there is no hope for it." He's reminding us that we can all too easily forget how structured our minds are and how readily we can get stuck in the ruts of our own patterns and our own ways of seeing the world. We too often cannot visualize the path to take in a difficult situation if it's not right in front of our faces. We can box ourselves into lesser choices when we only consider the typical options. It might seem a little bit strange to think about faith as embracing the absurd. But just like Einstein was teaching us, when you come up against a problem that is so enormous, when you come up against a circumstance that is defying your ways of thinking about it, when you come up against a possibility you don't know what to do with, you don't know how to categorize, the absurdity of it all is exactly what you have to embrace in order to work your way through it. It's where Paul takes us, and I want to walk very carefully through a passage to demonstrate this to you, and that passage is in Romans chapter 5. Paul begins the passage in this way. We exult, meaning we have pride in, or are confident about, or we boast in the hope of the glory of God. Now, I want to call attention to this word doxa because it can be tough. Glory often gives us the impression of the splendor or the radiance of God, but it can also designate the opinion or the judgment. And I have to wonder if we should not shade more in that direction here. That is, Paul is saying we are confident in our hope for the good opinion or the judgment of God. And we can be so precisely because of the righteousness of this God who has extended grace towards us. But he doesn't stop there. He doesn't assume that this means we get a free and easy pass. Paul adds, not only that, but we also have confidence in pressure. Now this word, thlipsis, means distress or affliction as well as pressure, but I chose pressure because the word itself has roots in being constricted, that is, pushed in, cornered. In a way, it's trying to say left without any apparent way out. You have to ask, why would we be sure-footed? Why would we be confident in such a situation? Well, Paul says this. We know that pressure brings about endurance. This endurance word is the ability to remain steadfast under that pressure, not giving up, not giving in. That's what we can accomplish. We are not, in other words, easily defeated or knocked back. But Paul is still not finished yet. He says that endurance, and then he adds one more word here. This last word, dokime, is the yield of endurance. It is typically translated as character. We say endurance produces character. But that's not exactly what the word means. It means something that has been proven via testing. Our ability to stand up is proof about what is at our core. What does that proof-tested ability produce? Well, that proof-tested ability produces hope. Now, you think we're at the end of the chain, and we're almost there. But Paul says, through all of this, we remain filled with expectation and even have trust or confidence, because that's really what he means by hope. Because every stage of the struggle brings about for us something transformative. It shows us in the process of being made right. For Paul, this is not some vague pie-in-the-sky imagination, some dream of what happens. He wraps it up this way. That hope does not disgrace or frustrate us, because God's love has been poured forth into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. To sum it up, we are not left in a situation of shame or in a place where we're banging our heads against a wall. We are instead filled up with a love, and that love is what is driving us forward to these new things, new possibilities, new efforts. It gives us everything we need to keep faith with what God is pushing us towards. But we can't forget, it is not simple, it is not blind, it is not a one-time, once and for all confession of belief that never has to be repeated, re-examined, or rethought. Rather, it is a day in and day out commitment. What we are moving towards may not always have a visible outcome in sight, but we stick to it even when we reach a dead end, even when we are at an impasse. It is learning to live into the idea that God could call that which was not existing into existence. I often think of Nelson Mandela in this regard. You will remember that he spent 27 years as a political prisoner. He was sentenced to life in prison. The majority of that time on Robben Island, he could see the mainland and life going on in his native South Africa just 4 miles away. But here he was, largely for this 27 years, confined to a tiny cell. He spent long stretches in isolation. He faced many abuses. He missed a ton of his life. He didn't see his children grow up. He couldn't attend the funerals of his mother or of his eldest son when he was killed in a car accident. And yet, Nelson Mandela never gave up or he never gave in. He was a reader. He used his time to do things as varied as studying Islam because he thought it was important to better understand it. He learned the language of Afrikaans to communicate with his jailers and talk to them about why he was there and what he wanted for the country. And he completed, after 46 years from the date of his first enrollment, a law degree. Nelson Mandela continued to strive, in spite of his confinement, to become the person he wanted to be. And then, as the world around him began to change, his life took turns no one, not even him, could have anticipated. A mere 3 years after a release, he might never have imagined coming given his life sentence. He was the co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize with de Klerk for helping to bring an end to apartheid. And just over 4 years following his freedom, he not only voted for the first time in his life, but he became South Africa's first democratically elected president. Here is what he says in his book, Long Walk to Freedom. I am fundamentally an optimist. Whether that comes from nature or nurture, I cannot say. Part of being optimistic is keeping one's head pointed towards the sun, one's feet moving forward. There were many dark moments when my faith in humanity was sorely tested, but I would not and could not give myself up to despair. That way lays defeat and death. He sounds an awful lot like Paul here, because Paul affirms the same things in this passage on faith. Abraham is an exemplar of that trait because he is willing, no matter how strange the choices might seem, to hang in there with God. He, as we've said, does not always get it right. He does not always see the logic of what God is doing, or even the possibility of what God is promising. But it's not blindness that compels him forward. It is not that he is easily led or too naive to question God. We see Abraham moving through a life that has both successes in what he thinks God has asked of him and coming up short moments of what he ought to be about. We see him in a relationship with God that is both accepting of what he hears God saying, and challenging God intently. In sum, he's an awful lot like we are. Our faith is, in fact, not perfect, but it is something that keeps us moving. Sometimes, maybe a little bit too often, our lives do not unfold as we want. It is faith, however, that guards against despair, and it guards against us getting lost in our confusion or in our pain or in circumstances that just overwhelm us. Faith is a call that is never done. It is one that can be, at different times, reassuring, demanding, compelling, and sometimes disturbing. And yet it is a way of life to which we all aspire, because in such a life we discover the divine. Thank you, and I'll look forward to continuing Romans with you in November.